Hello and welcome to Mind the Gap, making education work across the globe with me, Tom Sherrington. And this time, no Emma, because she's unable to join us, but we are joined by an amazing person who I've known for many years now. He's like my counterpart on the other side of the world, the amazing Dr. Simon Breakspear. Hi, Simon.
Tom, good to be with you.
No, it's fantastic. I mean, it's funny, on this podcast, it's like we were saying, we could just have a chat because we know each other quite well. And I've had the privilege of working with you in Australia, and the work that you're doing out there is amazing. Everyone seems to know who you are, and I've met you at various conferences, and we've teamed up a few times. But you're doing such interesting work, and it's got resonance for everyone in any school, I would say. So, welcome to the podcast. If you were going to just tell people listening or watching us what your kind of work is, just summarize just some of the things you're up to and kind of how you've arrived at where you are.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Well, it's great to be together, and we built our relationship originally online, and then tried to get you to come to Australia, and then unfortunately COVID got in the way. And then over the last couple of years, it's been fantastic having you back and forth to Australia and just building some of this collaboration. And I think our work has overlapped around trying to create tools, practical approaches that help busy school leaders, head teachers, teachers be able to be more evidence informed and improve what they do. And my journey started in med school. I started university in med school, and a year in, I said, actually, I think I want to drop out to become a teacher. My mum didn't love that, but I did it anyway. And I actually did a psychology degree and then started teaching high school. And so for me, from that very outset, I was really interested in processes of human development, human learning. I didn't really mind what I taught, but I was incredibly interested in, I guess, how schools are places where young people get to grow and develop and learn, and how teaching is the process by which we can change the trajectories of young people. I got interested in educational research and got an opportunity to do my postgraduate study probably earlier than I expected to do. And that, I think, sort of gave me a bit of a path to say that I probably wasn't going to work in one school, but I wanted to be sort of an applied academic. And people like Michael Fullan, Professor Viviane Robinson, Tony Bright were real inspirations for me, thinking about how you can take research, take ideas about improvement, and then make them available and useful to school teams. So what I spend my days doing, Tom, is basically trying to understand problems that head teachers, principals, and their teams are trying to solve. And then I try to look at the research literature and the improvement science and implementation science literature and say, is there anything in here that could actually help those leaders do their job more effectively, but with less effort? And that's what I do. And so I normally try to develop practical tools and frameworks, things around professional learning like teaching sprints, things about de-implementation like pruning, things around leading school improvement, which I call agile school improvement processes. So I'm always trying to generate new ideas from the literature, get it to work with schools I work with closely, and then share that more broadly.
And it's fascinating work because I feel like this sort of system improvement is a not that well understood. And in the UK, for example, there's lots of mechanisms, and it's a very fractured landscape, with multi-academy trusts
Yes.
and local authority schools and
Mhm.
church schools and so on and so on. And some of those are overlapping. And I know in Australia you've got the Catholic system, which is very big, and then you've got obviously government schools and independent schools and blah blah blah. And the levers that people have to pull to, they're responsible for a whole group of schools, and then they've got to think, well, we're kind of like X layers away from a teacher teaching more effectively and children learning more. So we've got to have systems and so on. And to have somebody that they can call on, and it nearly always seems to be you, they kind of say, how do we do this? How do we organize ourselves? And do you find it interesting that people are kind of thrown into these roles and system leaders without really
Mm.
quite knowing exactly what to do?
Yeah, it's such a good insight, Tom. And I'm always asking, where can I add a unique contribution? And there's lots and lots of wonderful colleagues of mine working shoulder to shoulder with teachers, many with leaders, but very few have tried to think about what are the tools, approaches, frames that would help someone in a system role actually get their head around what they're trying to do and hopefully do more good than harm within that role. And you're right. And here in Australia, we have 6 states, 2 territories. And in every one of those states and territories, we have a government system, a range of Catholic systems and some independent schools. And so it's quite a fragmented landscape for just 10,000 schools. But I try to work wherever possible where I can make the greatest impact. So that's normally with the government system or the large Catholic systems, and trying to work in a way at that system level where, say, in New South Wales, my home state, um, we have 2,200 schools as part of the government system. Or in Victoria, my second home, where I'm there every week, at some point, over 1,500 government schools. Or one of our largest Catholic systems that you and I both work in partnership in, Melbourne Catholic, that's 330 schools. So at least there's the potential there, Tom, if you can get this kind of work right, even if you're making a smaller difference, you could really move the needle. If you can get that work right. But often, people who are ministers of education in a state level, they'll come in from a different portfolio. They'll be allocated that. They probably won't have a lot of domain-specific knowledge and understanding about how schools work. They'll take a lot of advice from their advisors. Often senior bureaucrats and civil servants here in Australia don't come out of education. They come across from other areas and just pop up, and suddenly they're in charge in 2,200 schools. So for me, what I'm always trying to ask is, how do I help that person connect what they're trying to do in policy all the way down to the classroom? And I'm always trying to connect kind of the neuron for the psychology, neuroscience perspective that I bring through to the teaching and the classroom dynamics, school dynamics, network dynamics, and then all the way up. And trying to help them think about that pathway of impact, or potentially even a pathway of inhibiting what schools are trying to do, even though they're coming maybe from a good intention for improvement. System leaders often don't have a history of what's been tried before. And so what I'm often trying to do, mate, is think about things. What can we learn from the literacy and numeracy strategy of England under the Blair days? What can we learn from Michael Fullan and the work in Ontario in sort of 2007 through to 2015? What can we learn from the Victorian department's work going on now around a large-scale implementation of teaching and learning, and helping them see comparators and then helping them see what's happened across history? Hopefully will mean that they don't just grab an old playbook, but they actually think about what might be more effective in helping schools improve.
Yeah, and that's what I love. I remember doing the first event that we did together. You have this whole bit where you're kind of saying, "Okay, guys, who remembers? Who remembers? Who remembers?" And you're tossing out these sort of like acronyms. I mean, and I didn't understand what any of them were, but
Oh, really?
I totally understood what it was like. That's some old assessment framework. That's a whole curriculum
Yeah.
thing. That was a government initiative that's been abandoned. That was a national appraisal system that's now been tanked. It's like you have the Australian version of what we have as well, like initiatives which have launched and crashed, launched and crashed. And so it's no surprise that you've got teachers who are just thinking like, whatever, it's just
Absolutely.
that's a sort of white water, sort of permanent sort of turmoil. And you capture that brilliantly with people and you relate to that. So I love that big picture, but then also you go down to the micro. So you're very intentional and about even like, for example, the dynamics of a meeting. So that how people talk and who talks and making sure everyone talks. All these sorts of it's very granular at that level. But in order to get people to move things in the right direction, you've got to have kind of a sense of purpose. So I feel like you have this amazing sort of helicopter view of the system, which probably not many people have. And then like the people with Max, the Melbourne Catholics, who are, I'd say they're exceptional in their sort of ambition
Mm.
with a curriculum and teaching and learning and a kind of infrastructure. But it's still a large undertaking, and you've got to move people forward who are autonomous beings. You've got individual head teachers who feel autonomous, teachers obviously who do, and
Yes.
but they're saying that you've got this sort of shared vision. And it's interesting that interface between like collective action, shared vision, and the need to celebrate autonomy. So, I mean, when you approach these systems, I mean, do you have a kind of, and we're going to talk about some of your books in a minute, but do you have
Sure.
a set of like reference points for them, or do you have to sort of take it kind of case by case?
Yeah, so I definitely take it case by case. And I think one of the things that working at different levels, from teachers to school leaders and head teachers through to a network level, so a cluster of 25 schools or so, and then all the way through to the system, is I constantly keep taking the helicopter up and then back down again. And that's part of the joy of my work, that I can try to have the conversation with the director or someone leading work over a large group of schools. And then my job is to get right down as close as possible down to schools. How is this actually landing? How is it perceived? Down to teachers, and then back up again. Because often, whilst schools and teachers might, be frustrated with what those people up in the system are doing, the system is often frustrated with why aren't these schools implementing this already? And it's actually, to be honest, at the fundamental level, a breakdown of understanding of each other's roles and pressures, and a lack of opportunity for just open two-way communication. And so we're always talking here in schools about how what the system doesn't understand, and the system's up there frustrated, feeling real pressure, whether from the political system or from their own governance structures, about what needs to happen. So part of my role is to go in and say, what's everyone saying at different levels? What actually are the incentives driving their behavior, and what do we not understand about each other? I
Yeah,
think we've learned over the last 20 years of school improvement that systems don't change, people do, and that very rarely can systems actually change what schools do. They can be an enabler, and they can sometimes have compliance levers they can pull, but it's very unlikely to result in sustainable change. People will just do what I call improvement theatre, Tom. They'll just do a few things that they think the system wants them to show, and once the system stops looking at them or checking them, they'll revert back to what they wanted to do anyway. So two-way learning, partnership is the only real way. And I think the literature that David Hargraves and others have pushed in England around self-improving schools, I would say self-improving schools that are deeply networked together and in relationships of peer support and challenge with both other schools and the system, is sort of my guiding direction. And we're trying to play long-term games. So I'll often, when I'm talking to systems, say, let's not play this game unless we've got a 5 to 7 year horizon. The only
mm,
games worth playing in education are long-term horizon games. The only games worth playing are ones where there's more relational trust in the bucket at the end of the work than there was at the beginning. And we need to stop being in a view that there's something wrong to be fixed, or someone needs to change their mindset. And we need to get right down to what are the tools or resources that could make it easier for these professionals who are pushed pretty hard to do the things we think are going to pay off for them. And then lastly, I'm always trying to help them work on something in the right sequence, that the people doing the work would actually get some impact, not just that that learning would improve, but there might be some other things to do with their workload, their efficiency, that they would experience a positive uptick, because we're trying to open up that kind of cycle of momentum where people think, not that we have to, but we get to. We tried something out. Actually, it's made my job more effective and a little bit more enjoyable. I wouldn't mind going through another cycle of that. And so most of what I'm trying to set up is the first few experiments. I guess I'm a high school science teacher at heart. Everything
yeah.
for me is running small little experiments that help people in the front line experience and benefit. And then that starts to drive their internal motivation to keep working on trying to implement the work that we think's got a good founding and a good reason to pursue and use their change efforts for.
And I think like in the context in Australia, where I think there's some really positive things happening around
Yeah, me too.
evidence engagement. The fact that you now have, a whole body dedicated to research dissemination, and that's that,
Mhm.
and you've got research ed movements and really positive change around understanding about reading and good, interesting curriculum change. It's just been quite well received and so on. So I feel like that all has to be then delivered. And of course, there's a whole sort of pedagogical side of it, which is where I come in with my stuff. So let's talk about some of the things that you've been talking about. And one of the things is let's talk about pruning. So I don't have this to show because I've
Here you go. I'll
my
show
book
you one
is
of the copies.
my book has gone the way of all good books, which is into my wife's school. So that's it. So the pruning
That's
principle,
its natural habitat, Tom. Off
exactly.
off the shelf and into a school is ideal for me.
That doesn't mean that the books behind me are not good books, should I say? But I have to keep some for myself. But I only had one of them, and I gave it away. So I, it's a fascinating concept. So the pruning principle is a now I know some people will have heard of Dylan Williams' de-implementation. So we
Yeah.
can talk about that. So that is it's kind of in the same territory. But I won't say anymore. You just tell people kind of why you wrote that book, and I know you didn't write it on your own, but why you wrote that book, and what it's trying to say.
Yeah, thanks for the setup, Tom. And there are no new ideas, right? It's just your way of sharing them. And one of the things I try to do in my work is try to think what's worthy of a book where there could be an idea that's easy to get your head around, a process, and something that could really resonate and spread within the context of a school. And I suppose what I was noticing post-COVID is all the COVID promises that we made each other when we all had a quiet weekend during some type of lockdown. And we actually said, this is quite nice. Like, not that lockdown's nice, but wow, we've calmed our whole life schedule. We've got time to pick up hobbies and work again. Maybe you were playing more music then, Tom, and people were cooking more and relating more. And we had the same with our schools. Often there was just a reduction there of some of the events and the extra things we were running. And there was a period there where we thought, wait, maybe post-COVID will be different in education. Maybe we'll go through this prioritization where we'll know what really matters because we've run this incredible experiment of pausing a lot of things. We'll decide what we'll bring back and what we won't. And of course, by mid 2022, it all came roaring back and a bunch of other stuff as well. And so when I'm working with teachers and head teachers, I'll often ask them, hey, are you busier than you were 3 years ago? And they say, yeah. And I say, for how long has that been true? If you went back to 2019 and then 2016, and those who've been in the game for a while describe a ramping up of more and more things that are on the dance card for them to do. I say, okay, well, it's 2025. Hey, in which year do you expect this to get better? Like, will it get better about 26 or 2027? And they always just laugh. They go, and I say, what? They go, they don't. Imagine a situation, Tom, where you're saying, right now I feel overwhelmed and overloaded. The
Yeah.
past used to be better, and I'm not hopeful that there's any horizon where I can imagine this turning the corner.
Wow.
And so, in that state, for any profession to live in and sit in, no wonder we get a lot of the discourse and the narrative that we get. And I get it. I'm married to a primary school teacher. I've got three sister-in-laws who are teachers. I've got my mum was a teacher. My mother-in-law is an independent school principal. We have these conversations every week in some ways. And so say, well, how do we break through that? We can't just keep talking about the problem, and we can't keep saying that the problem, if it is there, of overload needs to be sorted out by government. We're going to have to take some collective agency for this problem. Now, de-implementation is the correct term. I spend my time as an academic from University of New South Wales, where I'm an adjunct, looking at improvement science, implementation science, literature. I find though sometimes where the concept is correct, like de-implementation, it's a six-syllable word. And I don't know about you, Tom, I don't really want to be invited to a de-implementation meeting.
It is six syllable.
Be-
That's counted.
Is it? I'm glad you checked. Um, but I don't want, I'd be worried if I got invited. Am I going to get de-implemented? So de-implementation comes from healthcare. I think there's a huge amount of benefit in the concept, particularly when we're looking at something that isn't aligned with the evidence. And we have to go through a process of respectfully saying we're going to de-implement this approach that's no longer aligned with the best evidence, say in early years literacy, and we're going to move towards an approach that's based on the evidence. But there's a whole range of other things where there's just not that many things in most schools now, particularly in England, maybe in Southeast Australia, where there's that much work to do on that area. In fact, there's a whole range of other things that I would say where we need to subtract or cut back, not necessarily because the thing is bad or not aligned with the evidence, but because we don't have the bandwidth or because
Yeah.
we're sort of collapsing under our own educational hoarding. Or it was going well for a few years, Tom, but actually we're getting diminishing returns. And so I was looking for a concept that could be used more easily, that was connecting subtraction with positive outcomes. And I was walking around in a garden, or a little orchard down in the Southern Highlands, about an hour and a half outside of Sydney, and I looked at all of the fruit trees that have been cut back pretty harshly, and I thought, pruning, prune. The verb is prune that we're looking for. And
Yeah.
I just tested it out, Tom, like you do, tested it out in the schools I work with, and it resonated with people. People said it back to me, and I thought, oh, I've got an idea here. So my contribution to the area here, Tom, is not, of course, Dylan and Hattie's book on de-implementation. Others have written well on this, but I was trying to build on that and find an idea that teachers and school leaders and systems could all think about regular rhythms of subtractive change that they, I think, need tools and routines and processes for not just additive change, but also subtractive change. And they need a language they can use with regular rhythms, not a one-off big prune, but weekly pruning, monthly pruning, pruning before school improvement planning.
Yeah,
And that's where we've seen a real movement take off, that they have picked up this concept, which is grounded in the literature on de-implementation, but I think better connects for educators a sense of subtraction and longer term growth, vitality, and fruitfulness, because most educators struggled with the idea of subtraction because they care so much. And they
yeah.
thought that subtracting was really backing away from caring. But if I said regular subtraction is the way to get long term impact and vitality, I was trying to rework their mental architecture to connect subtraction with actual impact and caring. And that's the work we've been trying to do under that area.
The biological analogy works brilliantly because
Yeah.
pruning plants. I mean, I know this from you know my wife is a brilliant pruner because she doesn't hold back.
Well,
It's
she
like
hasn't pruned you yet, so
no, but
but yes,
it's just sort of in a sense she's fearless. It's like wow, you really cut it, and it's like yeah, because it will be better the next year, and it's like and then it is, and you think wow, so that worked. But I'd be like nipping away and being too scared. And I know people who really hate cutting anything back because they're too worried about it. But then, so I mean, I like the subtitle of this book is Mastering the Art of Strategic Subtraction Within Education. So, but I do think it's useful. And then just people, the idea of bandwidth is big. I go to schools all the time where, there's lots of things going on. Sometimes people, they're badge collectors. They'll tell you, oh, we're doing such and such a coaching program,
yeah,
but also that coaching program with that platform and with that resource. And we sent people on
yeah,
this course. And then
yeah,
we've had this experience, we've had these discussions ourselves where, okay, we've got this cooking. Why have they asked that person and that person and that person also to bring their ideas into the mix? Because you
yeah.
just added like, whoa, whoa, whoa. It's just getting messy. And how does anyone know what to focus on? Because you just can't keep chucking more at it.
That's well put.
I'm
So
like,
I call this additivitis, and it's the additive trap in education. And so, look, my first degree is psychology, right? So I'm always asking, what's driving that behavior? Like, why do they, commit to working with Tom and the walkthroughs team, and then at the same time add two or three other things that are analogous at the same time? What would cause someone to do that? And then I have to ask, what would cause someone to do that? And often it's about this tying up of how do I make something better? Add more to it. And humans, the psychological literature tell us, actually have a natural inclination to trying to make problems better by adding. We have a natural tendency to overlook subtractive solutions and look for adding. But secondly, they're often, Tom, trying to send signals of competence. What I realize is if you have an additive lens and you say, I've got Tom, but I can also add Tom plus two or three other things that are actually making the solution worse, but sometimes they think that the signals they're sending internally or perhaps out onto LinkedIn is, well, if one Tom is good, two or three other ones, doesn't that, make something better? Look, I'm working with all the big names in professional learning.
is
And
it a bit
so,
with hedging your bets a bit? Like they don't fully trust one solution is going to work. So they just think if
yeah.
I try three at the same time, hopefully something will work. Because they kind of we don't we're used to things not necessarily working and so on. So there's a bit of that going on. Belt and
It
brace.
is, but I would say that's very odd for anyone in education to think, given the limited bandwidth, given the limited time we've got for collaboration, professional learning. And so I just try to help people become aware of those beliefs. And Tom, when you say like you're a little trimmer and Deb gets in there and makes a big cut, I know that people have different inclinations within schools on pruning. And if someone's a little trimmer, I just say be a little trimmer for 6 months, but do lots of little trimming. And so
Yeah.
we might work with someone and say, I want you to find 1 hour as a head teacher a week you can trim. They go, okay, let's try it. So let's take three of your regular 1 hour meetings and cut them back by 20 minutes. So now they're 40-minute meetings rather than 1 hour. I've just saved you 1 hour. Well, I'm not sure they really value that time. Yeah, no, but let's just run a little experiment. Sorry, former high school science teacher. Let's just run an experiment. Could we run that for 1 month? And then at the end of that, talk to the people and say, did they really miss out on much by moving to 40 minutes? I bet they didn't even notice. We say those little trims of 3 times 20 minutes, that add up to 1 hour a week over a 40-week school year. That's 40 hours That's 1 week of work back. And we might just do that on something like small little trims to meetings. We might do it on small little trims to some responsibilities and tasks that are pretty low leverage that have got onto your agenda. That of course people don't want to trim because they want to show to everyone that they're willing to do the hard work. I'm saying we know that you're willing, but is it your highest possible contribution? We can go over to professional learning and find after this year through a review what things really haven't moved the needle on teacher knowledge, practice, and collaboration. And we might be able to pull out 4, 5, 10 hours of collective time next year and then reuse that energy for something that's more likely to have more impact. So I always just ask people just to get moving on the smallest little pruning experiments to build their own agency around subtraction. And we normally say organizationally, work on really low risk things. We're not trying to take out something early and build a culture where we collectively examine, then we cut
Whether it's
back,
worth
and
it.
then we nurture that space.
There's something we were saying that I just had this absolute moment of deep cringe about
Uh-oh.
about so when I first became a head teacher
Yeah.
in the UK, going back, 2008 that was. Um,
Uh-huh.
and I did this a couple of times afterwards in another job as well. I was so sort of impressed with myself for having a busy time diary, and when blogging came out, I've written two blogs about this, and I'll probably go and delete them now, where I sort of like published my calendar and sort of saying, whoa, look how busy I am. And it's like, look at all the different things I have to do, teaching, governors' meetings, this, that. And now I'm
Yes.
thinking, actually, that's just like an example of you're out of control. You're out of control.
Sure.
Like you're not in control of your work and you're not present enough. The reason why things aren't working is because you're not present enough and you're busy doing all this stuff and it's not the right stuff to be being busy doing. And I now it's just like it was happening in real time and I wasn't really even aware of it. And
Yeah.
I was even celebrating it for God's sake. And it's like if you feel things are out of control, you need to just think, I'm getting the hedge trimmers out. Because you've got to think you have to be in control. You have to be the one that's sort of saying like, I've got to manage this and I've got to what's the most
Yeah.
important thing. But having that moment or someone to give you the tools or the message. That's what I like. I mean, in the book, and this is I think it's worth saying this. The book isn't just like what you've just described makes sense straight away, but how there's a whole bunch of practical things to do which involve strategically looking at pulling back and it becomes like a thinking process in itself and
Yeah, trying to prime the opportunities for subtraction. Tom, subtraction is not always going to be the answer, but I try to say to people, we have to prime subtractive first thinking. So the first option we look to is, are there any opportunities here for subtraction in order to create longer term impact and vitality? So, that's a really normal story when I'm, in coaching relationships with head teachers and school leaders who have entered into a new role recently because we're all doing two jobs, right? One of them is to do the job, and the other one is to help people perceive us doing the job the way we want to be perceived. And it makes a lot of sense to me for you to
yeah,
put this out and say, I'm trying to put signals of caring and competence out there. And what's the language of how people out in our sector, how do they calculate the amount you care and how competent you are? Often it's been addition, how much is going on?
yeah,
And I'm trying to flip that narrative and say, in the book, say, look, have a bit of self-compassion about that. That really makes sense. But are you sure those internal beliefs and narratives are working for you? Are they over the next 5, 10 years going to make you more effective, your team more effective, your school more impactful? Why don't we play around with the idea that actually regular subtraction might make you more effective? Now, I'm not even going to ask you to work less, but I want you to reallocate, as in pruning. We don't take away the resource. We don't take away water, sunlight, nutrients in the soil. That stays the same, but we want to reallocate that to the areas that are going to be most fruitful. And so, yeah, we do it at the personal level, the team level, the school level, the system level. And I think pruning is a collective action problem. If one head teacher does it and everyone else is still in your 2008 mode, showing all of their busyness, culturally that's not going to shift. So getting more and more people within our team and then within our network to connect strategic subtraction
yeah,
with high levels of competence is how you start to change the norm where people are saying, no, our most effective leaders, wherever possible, are trying to get their workload at steady state more like 85 to 90% rather than running at 120%. And we
Yeah,
want to
exactly.
keep it there so that they can respond to urgent things, but also so they've got bandwidth. When they see an opportunity, they've actually got a small amount of bandwidth, 4 hours a week or so, that they could deploy against that rather than already being overrun.
Yeah, and that's so it's so essential. I think one of the little things I often have a conversation about is people's perception that they don't have time to observe their colleagues in their team
Okay.
because they think like I've got to sort of observe for an hour. It's gonna I then have to write it up because they have to type up the report of the that's gonna take me ages, and then I have to meet them and talk about it, and that's gonna take me ages. So they're imagining like a 3 hour sink of time, and I'm just saying there because like drop in for 10 minutes.
Yes.
Don't write a report, just meet them and talk for 10 minutes and do that quite regularly. And that that will make more difference probably than that big bloated thing that you're imagining. And you don't even have to do it. So and they're going, oh my God, that's like radical. But it's those sort of thin mindsets around that. Anyway, I'm gonna pull park a little bit. One thing I want to say before we move on to talking about this book is that we have to credit Michael Rosenbrock, who so he's your co-author. What's his role in this? Just to
Yeah, Michael's a terrific friend and co-author, and I'm so glad you've raised him. He is a science teacher like me, spent longer in schools and in leadership in school teams, and spent some time with Evidence for Learning, which is our partner organization to EEF, and that's where Michael and I have got to know each other. And Michael did some of the translation work from the EEF work on de-implementation for Australia. So we'd been friends, and I reached out and I said, "Look, I want to write this book about pruning, but I don't want to jump over the fact that this is really built on the early work on de-implementation in education. Hey, do you want to team up?" And so Michael and I were together on Friday. We run a secondary school network for about 40 secondary schools together in Victoria, and we'd been in a regular level of sort of sharing ideas. And I say, hey, do you want to bring some of that foundational work you've done on de-implementation and help me take this pruning idea to the next level? So
Mm.
one of the things that I try to do when I'm writing and when I'm thinking, I'm aware I'm not full time in schools, and so I try to work alongside people who've spent longer in schools or who are currently in schools. And Michael's role in this has really been to ground it. Would this really work? And also try to help find the right case studies and examples. So yeah, it's terrific. I'm sure you find it as well, Tom. Writing alongside other people with different experience
Oh, for sure.
really just helps test your ideas and improve them. And Michael's definitely one of those partners for me.
Oh, absolutely. This is why I like doing this podcast with Emma because she's like, we have different perspectives, but they we kind of,
I know. How did I miss out on getting Emma? That's mostly why I turned up to this call.
Oh no, I'm sorry, you just left with me. It's the short straw. What can I tell you? So look, the next thing though is like a kind of an example of your other type of thinking, and this is, I guess, another partnership because this I want to talk about this book here, the teaching sprints, and it's the book, it's the whole concept. And you wrote this book with Bron Ryrie Jones, who we've had on the podcast as well.
Yeah.
And sprints, I mean, cards on the table. Sprints is one of the ideas that we very keen to promote in a walkthroughs, and it's a really it's one of those sort of ideas which you just think it's got so many ideas packed into it, and it's
Yes.
so practical, and it's sort of it delivers on some of the ideas we've just been talking about, like getting things to work in a lean way,
Thank
and
you.
it's so. But again, so that I don't sort of mess it up, it's just what what is teaching sprints and why are you so sort of committed to the idea? I mean, I think it's a brilliant idea, but what is it? Let's tell people.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Well, sprints is the reason why I reached out to you originally. Sprints is my attempt to come up with a feasible, sustainable model for pedagogical change in teams. And in 2015, I was doing a project here in New South Wales and another one with the Teachers Union, the Alberta Teachers Association. I was in partnership with them, trying to look for more effective ways of doing short cycle professional learning. And everything I could find, both in the literature and in practice, were very long inquiry cycles here in New South Wales, in New Zealand, and in Canada. Everyone was caught up in this idea of teachers, if it was professional learning, needed to be very open-ended. It was often a 7 or 8 step process. It would last all year, sort of culminate in some sort of presentation. And the idea was very much almost like inquiry learning for teachers. Teachers needed to come up with their own problem, generate their own problem of practice or hunch, try to see that through. And to be honest, I'd get halfway through the year and go and chat to teachers, and most of them would say, I don't know where we're up to. I'm not even sure what problem we're working on. Now, of course, there were 10 or 20% of teams that were just flying ahead, but it really didn't work for the majority of people. And at this point, I had one young kid. As I was working on this, I had another one and then another one. We had three under four. My wife is a teacher. And it just kind of got me thinking about, why is professional learning run this way? And so what I did is what I normally try to do is look at different literature. So I was looking at the literature on deliberate practice, Anders Ericsson, that work around how do we get short cycles of work. In improvement science, I was looking at PDSA cycles, which no one could remember what are the steps or what they were. They were coming from
EDSA, what
healthcare.
does that stand for? Can you remember?
Plan, do, study, act, maybe?
Okay.
Geez, I should know this as
Yes.
someone, but I've said PDSA so many times. Maybe analyze is the last one. That's the only one. But it was this process of sort of moving through cycles where a healthcare team would try to work out an intervention they wanted to run, and they would run PDSA cycles. So I was like, okay, how do I take deliberate practice from the psych literature, PDSA cycles from improvement science that I don't think really resonate with teachers? And then I had a dear friend in Silicon Valley, Nelson Gonzalez, and he introduced me to sort of agile methodologies. And I really like the word sprint, which comes from software, the Scrum methodology. And so what I tried to do was boil those things down to a short cycle process that basically said, work on instructional habits, because unless you're going to sustain this over time, it's really not going to last. Work on a shift that's much smaller than what you're often being asked to do. So we call this a tiny shift. One small technique or practice that you think could solve a real challenge that you're facing in the classroom, and that's got good evidence behind it. Stephen Higgins said, research gives us our best bets. So rather than wondering, what Steve or Fiona in your team says we should work on for the next PLC cycle, let's work on something that the research says will work. And then let's engage in some intentional, deliberate practice within the classroom. So that was the original idea in 2016. We called it improvement sprints originally, and then people said it sounded too negative. And then for about 2 years, we were calling it learning sprints because it was meant to be about teacher learning that impacts student learning. And then it was Bron herself actually when we teamed up in 2019 and then into think about the book. She said, "Why don't you just call it teaching sprints?" And I said, "It's too late. We've got hundreds of schools using this." And then you realize that most of the schools that were ever going to use it hadn't even heard of it yet. And so, all credit to her, she just said, let's just call it teaching sprints. And then in COVID, when we actually had some time, we sat down in 2020 to write the book. So it's a very simple process. It's 3 steps, Tom. Prepare, sprint, review. It's done in teams. The prepare has some protocols to help teams learn about and build an understanding about a certain research-informed teaching strategy that could solve a real learning challenge in their context, and try to get very specific about the technique they want to work on. Sprint is a 2 to 4 week period of intensity, where if you're a primary elementary school teacher, you're normally just applying that technique in one domain area. If you're a high school teacher, middle school teacher, you're trying to apply that just in one of your classes. So maybe you only see them 4 or 5 times a week, limiting the practice space to something that feels manageable. And then in review, we come back to review, how did it go in your integrating this within your craft? What did you notice for student learning, maybe for student work and outcomes? And then the real question is, how might you then integrate that within your ongoing repertoire? Over a year, you might do 3 or 4 sprints, one per term. Over 3 years, that would be improving 3 to 12 things in your practice. And as you know so well, Tom, if you pick 9 to 12 things over 3 years that you either enhanced your technique on or added to your repertoire, you could become a dramatically more effective and more efficient educator. So that's the theory. We normally get people to use the process in whatever team-based collaborative structure that they've got. And it's meant to be a really adaptable process. So lots of people use it but don't call it sprints, and I'm absolutely fine with that. It's about getting to grips with what is the underlying ideas here. And then once you've got those ideas, we encourage people to adapt it and adjust it in a way that would work for them.
And there's lots of things I love about it. Okay, and I guess you're right. I mean, I think some of the models that we promote I'll talk about, team coaching has got a slightly
Yeah.
different aspect to it, but it's very similar. And I think one thing I really like about it is, well, let me just list them all. There are two things, three things I love about it, four things.
Give it to me. Keep going. Give me a list.
So before I lose count, I'll just list them. So to start with, I like the energy it brings. So this idea of 2 to 4 week cycles and the fact that
Yep.
it's called sprints. So the explicit thing there is we're doing it now.
Yes.
We're not just doing a PD about some idea that
Nice.
one day you might find some time to implement. It's now. It's urgent. The word sprint means we're doing it. So that's the first thing. It's energetic. Secondly, it's collaborative, but not just
Yes.
collaborative. It's collective, and I think that's a slightly different thing. For me, the collective
Mm,
means we're not just working together; we're doing it together. We're all
nice.
doing it. So when you're in a team, you're saying, "Let's do this. What do we need to do?
Mm,
What problem do we have? What should we focus on?" And so there's this kind of sense of collective action, and I'm absolutely convinced that that trumps the power of individualizing teacher feedback and improvement. I'm
me
absolutely
too.
certain of it from my experience that
Me
that
too.
sense of, oh, everyone's doing it, I'm doing it, we're doing it. So we don't have to think about, I've got a problem that I need to fix. It's like, oh, we all have a problem we all need to fix. So again, it leads to the energy. It creates change, and
Nice.
it also builds on the three big ideas which you explore in the book. Best bet. So the things you're asking people to select are evidence-informed strategies, that you have to practice them. So we can't just talk about them; we have to do them. And the third thing is there's the scale. So it's the size of the shift you're talking about, and I that emphasis on small. That's so useful because it's only 2 to 4 weeks. If PD processes or cycles which are longer end up being bloated with too many things.
Hmm.
It's got all these ingredients. The thing that's I'm not entirely clear about is how you see the role of kind of a teacher self-report and saying how it's going for themselves in the absence of observation, or where observation, or what
Right.
Jim Knight would call reality checks, generally kind of fits into. How does that work with the sprint?
Yeah, I appreciate the question, and just to connect to those 3 points, you can imagine, therefore, Tom, why I had to reach out to you, particularly when you're in the early days of Rosenshine and others, because it was a how process. It was energizing, short, collaborative. Um, but it was all built on having those research-based best bets. And I was spending a lot of time trying to troll through the internet, try to, trawl through the internet to try to get the different pieces and have links to certain resources that they could use to then mobilize. And so, obviously, the work that you've led, I was very grateful for, because I had a how, but I didn't have clear what's. And as you started to do Rosenshine and then in a walkthroughs became the great enabler of that process, because people could choose a walkthrough, they could have their prepare meeting, they could sprint for 2 to 4 weeks, and then they could review. And so thank you, mate, because most of the schools that have done sprints have found it much more effective when they've brought those two ideas together. Your question's a good one, and all of my work always starts with what can we do from where we are now? Because most of my research colleagues always talk about comprehensive. What are all the things you need? So the terrific EEF, um, best evidence synthesis on effective professional learning, might say, you need these four elements. You need to have knowledge building, you need to motivate teachers, you need to, develop the technique, and you need to embed it and the sub mechanisms. And it's true, you do need all of those pieces probably to get to the final impact. But sometimes you can't get to all of those pieces from where you are right now as a team or as a school. So
Mm,
what I've tried to say is that teaching sprints is a good starting point. Where would we be? We would have teachers engaging with research. Okay, that's a good starting point, rather than just chatting to what Steve suggested. They would connect that research to a learning model. And I've learnt lots from you about how to use Willingham's model to help people reason why this technique would work. We've got to get people out of avoiding and delaying practice improvement, because it doesn't really matter if I don't practice and like improve my practice this week or this month. And the 2 to 4 weeks, let's just get with something that we can get moving and be more metacognitive about our teaching, and then let's review. So for me, that's a foundational thing that we might need to run a number of sprints, but they might be kind of evidence light, and they might, to your thoughtful critique here, there might be a fair bit of error rate in self-report about how things are going. I can live with that for a few cycles because for a lot of schools, it might take a year just to get those things in motion. But
Yeah.
sprints is an adaptable process because then you could layer things on. To
Yeah.
your point, I would love to get observation, but if I say you have to do observation to run a sprint,
Yeah.
half of the schools I work with will say, "Oh, we can't make that work in our timetable," and then they don't do all those things first.
No.
So you can then layer on kind of these activators of the process to get much more impact, which would be connected to the EEF mechanisms and characteristics. So one thing you could layer on is an observation, a peer or an expert observation. That would layer on during the sprint, and everyone would be clear because the sprint is so focused what the observation is about, whether it's observing how students are responding to the change teaching technique or routine, or whether the teacher requests some observation and feedback about their actual craft. You could also layer on more evidence collection during the review process, evidence collection involving some samples of student work. Um, but again, when I used to ask for that, the first model of sprints required it. I'd find some teachers didn't even start the sprint because they were so stressed about the fact that they needed to sort of collect some sort of pre-test and post-test. And so I sort of feel like it's one of those things where
Yeah.
it most people can get moving from where they are. And then you would say, how do I bring the literature on good observations? How could I bring the literature on evidence collection? How could I bring the literature on some of the work, that I've seen you do about modeling and rehearsal? Like, does in a typical prepare meeting, does the teacher really understand what this technique could look like? Have they had a chance to rehearse with colleagues, perhaps? Have they had it modeled? Have they seen a video example?
Yeah.
Well, no, probably not, Tom, in the first three sprints, because that, head of teaching and learning or director of teaching and learning is just trying to get some professional collaboration moving. But I'd
It's
love
interesting
to
hearing you
see that
say
in year two and year three. I add those ingredients over time, but the core model is meant to be the base level model, um, rather than the ideal model that I wish could be run. I don't
I
know. How
think
do you think through those
I feel like
feasibility
I
trade-offs?
think it's sort of interesting that it's good to talk these things through because and obviously I'm going to say a bit like well very much like your pruning book is that the teaching sprints book is full of that when you come to the section on review it doesn't just say like do a review sort of there's lots of stuff in there about how do we know like how do we know how it's going and what's the evidence base for that so it encourages people to start asking the question and probably for a lot of people in a professional setting where there's 4 or 5 or 6 people, whatever, doing this together, how do we know how well it's going? We just you saying, "I think it's going well," isn't going to be enough. So you start asking the question, and it might then become the conclusion of that is, if someone dropped in to watch me, I'd have a better insight, and the rationale for observation emerges from that. But you're talking about data collection, and of course, this is the thing we always say in our work. Most of the
Yeah.
time, you are by yourself anyway. So even if you do get observed, the only bit of you only observe like a fraction of your teaching. Most of the time, you're out there doing it, and you've got to be developing these tools of self-evaluation and critique. So I think you're really you're right about that. And boy, I mean, we were in a system discussion today, a huge group of schools in London, and again, how does the central team know how it's going? There's thousands of lessons going on every day. You can only sample a few. You've got to get teachers to own it, drive it, feel ownership, develop those skills. So the sprints is an excellent model. I mean, roughly how many schools? I mean, in Australia. Well, I know because you've talked because I know you do some of this work in Scotland and you do some work in Canada, but just in Australia, what sort of scale is
It's
sprints?
one of these hard things, Tom, because you've built through walkthroughs a membership and a community around the ideas. I just put these ideas out like an educational meme. I just sort of said, "Hey everyone, here's some work we've done." And then when Ron and I wrote the book, we literally wrote it in 2020. No one really wanted to talk about to teachers about needing to make incremental change in their practice in 2020. We were all just trying to survive and hang on. And so it's been this interesting thing. There would be hundreds, but every week, because I spend almost none of my time on teaching sprints, I tried to make it like an iPhone. And I don't mean like really sexy and expensive. I mean, you take it out of the box and you can basically use it without anyone. So on the website, all the protocols are there, downloadable for free. Implementation stories are there. And so there are definitely, 500 or more schools that are using teaching sprints in Australia and at least another 500 around the world. But there's probably many, many more because when I'm out there doing my other work, I hear people all the time saying, we're using sprints, this team is using sprints. So it's sort of one of those things that I actually need to do some
It's
case
phenomenal.
studies
I
of
mean,
going back and saying, what is the
yeah.
spread of this? I hear people winning awards for school improvement, and then they'll say, oh, one of our approaches that we've used is adapted teaching sprints. I thought, oh, wow, that's so good.
But
So
people, when
it's
I've been in Australia, I mean, like, people say it to me like it's just a thing everyone knows. Like they talk about.
yeah,
So when when we've done our sprints, oh, we'll use this in our sprints. So after we've done some of our sprints, it's like I have to go.
it's
Do you mean like the Breakspear Ryrie Jones sprints? And of course they go, yeah, well, of course, like, yeah, sprints. It's just there, and that's quite impressive. So I think it's
yeah.
people who,
I think it is. I would just say one of those ideas that every now and again, Tom, you get an idea that spreads without you.
yeah,
And, huge credit to Bron because her writing is much clearer than me and she brings such a deeper insight as a teacher educator and as a teacher with many more years experience than me. And I think the reason why when we teamed up to write up the book, why it's probably landed so well, is that combination of sort of me coming from applied research process, Bron bringing that, would it work with teachers, Simon? Would this work? What would it look like? And I think we ended up getting something that literally people take it out of the box and the reason I don't know they're using it is they either just use their online resources or they grab, this very short book and they go, oh yeah, I could do that. And they start getting moving. Now, there's probably a lot of maladaptive uses out there because obviously you've got dangers around when people are implementing things too far away from their original intent. But yeah, I do think it's one of those wonderful experiences as someone in my type of work who wants to put out ideas that make things better, but I don't want to be the limiting factor in that being able to spread. And yeah, you see it all over the place, but I don't necessarily, and I very rarely have to be there for that work. And that's been a
yeah.
real joy to watch that sort of scale and spread.
Well, I think it's what it shows is that you've got this sense of what's necessary. So you pick it up when you go around, and you've created something which is right down that granular level and disseminated it, like in the way you've described. At the same time as having the helicopter view that we talked about before, so you have this sort of, and I think that's so fantastic and it's so interesting, isn't it? I mean,
Thanks.
you're like busy doing all this system work, and then like you say, like there's something very networky about Australia. So you just mentioned 40 schools here. There's 100 schools. There's 30. It's like
Yes,
it's quite a common thing that schools are looking for common solutions. They're not all just totally isolated.
true.
One thing in the time that we've got left, and we don't have, I've just got a few minutes, but of course, the
Okay.
most recent, I mean, you're a very prolific man. Is the elevated conversations, and in a way, I mean, you said this before we started this recording, that in a way, this was almost like a precursor to sprints because this is like that. It says practical tools to make teacher collaboration count. So of course, sprints is an example of that. And
Yes.
what I'm fascinated by this, the dynamics of what how to organize a conversation with groups of people. And
Yeah.
people who've never studied that, you see a lot, they're just winging it. So you have a meeting of like 10 people around a table. And like, God,
Hmm.
I used to do this myself. And I sat in plenty of them where a person is talking and sort of there's no structure at all. There's no even an attempt to have a structure. It's just like
Sure.
random ad hocery. And then people leave the meeting going, did we decide anything? And we got a plan. Like it's just we talked forever and no one resolved anything. There was no plan, and not everyone's opinion. I didn't even get to say my bit. It's
Yes.
you, you've got all. This book is full of like again very practical things, and sometimes I think people are a bit like I don't know uncomfortable with this like structuring, and I just think like for example empathy square.
Sure.
Or deeper reasons. I think there's one of my favorite ones in here, where you're saying like that going beyond the kind of the surface, and it just helps you have a framework for thinking like what are our deeper reasons, and let's just follow this protocol, and it makes you just do the job better. I mean, so I mean, that's my take on it. It's its practical application in that book. You can almost imagine the content from the title, you'd think, but actually, when you get into the details, like, wow, that's
Mhm.
interesting. That's interesting. So, where do you see that working for people? Have you been promoting that particularly, or
Well, thanks, Tom. It's in that area where I don't have time to go work school to school, so I just sort of take my best ideas and I say, hey, if you've got, $25, you can get this book, or you could download all the tools online anyway. Like they're all available. I never want money to be an inhibitor to get your hands on the tools. But the basic idea is this, Tom. We don't have enough collaboration time, and most of us are trying to ask our systems, we need more collaboration time. And yet, when you actually look at the collaboration time you've experienced, whether it's professional learning, curriculum planning, first day back professional learning days, you go, how effective was that in elevating what I say, elevating your knowledge, elevating your practice, and elevating your actual energy around the work? Like, do you leave those times interacting with people feeling, hey, I want to go and teach more effectively. I'm energized for this work, or actually, does it suck your energy out? And so the basic idea, as everything, is I'm going to just work with the way things are, not the way things should be. I'm going to say, in the blocks of time you've got, these are really precious moments. And yet, most of the time, they drop into what I describe in the book as weary talk. And I want to know, how do you get above the line more often? And I've got a real, heart for mid-level leaders and senior leaders who are often still teaching in the classroom. One of the leadership roles I had was a year 12 coordinator. That's our sort of A levels year. And I had 220 students, and I'm still got a, 80% teaching load. And you're constantly rushing between both. And there's a lot of leaders who are rushing between teaching and leading, and particularly trying to teach and then go and run adult collaboration time. And in that busyness, they're often underprepared for their adult collaboration time. And then they'll just talk a lot during that period. And so, what I was trying to say is, why don't you shift your playbook? And rather than talking a lot and then the energy drops and then you think this isn't going well, why don't you say, what's the conversation we need to have? And which one of these seven protocols or tools, and it's just like my mixtape, Tom. It's just like the things that have been out there in the educational landscape for a while, and it's just Simon's take on those.
yeah,
Why don't I say which of these tools might help us have the conversation we need to have? And so, for example, if we've been finding that we're having conversations where we're complaining about the students getting in the way of our good teaching and the frustration, maybe we need the empathy square, because we need to attune with the human experience of students to understand their emotional and cognitive states and ask, what do we need to do as the adults to help them move forward? Or the deeper reason, which is just my version of a five whys, which I never found all
yeah,
that successful. Hey, are we talking about surface level frustrations? Do we need to get down to what are the deeper reasons that might be driving this? Maybe we've got some data out on the table. We've seen less reading growth from years 3 to year 5. Let's not just have a surface level, oh, yeah, it's because they're not reading enough at home. Let's actually get in and see whether we could get down to a more sophisticated understanding of why. So basically, I was trying to reduce the stress placed on leaders who have to run collaborative time, from preparing and speaking a lot to running collaborative tools that engage everyone in that discussion, have a tangible output. And then basically you can turn up to a meeting, even if you've only had 5 minutes to prepare, and say, which one of these tools would help us have the type of conversation we need to have? And how do I spend the 5 minutes I've got getting myself into the right state to lead this work rather than stressing about slides and other things? And that's really what I'm trying to do here, just trying to hand the things that I've used as a leader, the things I use when running things within schools, and saying to people, hey, if you had these seven tools in your toolkit, I think you could save many, many hours in a year and actually have much more effective collaboration time.
that's great. I like. You should have just called it Elevator Conversations, Simon's mixtape. I like it. But it's good, and I've been in leadership teams where we've introduced structure, like even for example, uh, two things I would recommend from mine. One of them is paired discussion, systematic.
Nice.
So you've got six people, that's
Yeah.
three pairs. We all talk like in pairs, and then we share what we were saying. Or because otherwise, not everyone gets to
Right.
speak. And you have if as soon as you've got meetings bigger than like five or six people, a lot. people don't just sit it out and just hang back, and you don't know what they're thinking.
Good.
People brood, and so systematically making it so that everyone's talking and then sharing. I think that's one. And the second one
It's
is
really good. Mm.
rotating the chair. And I don't know about this before, and this came from when I was the head in an international school, and one of my
Yeah.
assistant heads, who's now been a head many times herself, she did say to me, "Tom, you don't have to talk a lot in the meetings." And I said, "Do I? Is it really bad?" And she said, "Yeah, it's really bad." It's like, so I thought, oh my God. So I say, well, that's because I need to be chaired. Like someone needs to be able to say, Tom, okay, that's fine. And what about what
Got it.
about Patrick? What do you think? So I said, well, why don't you chair the next meeting then? And then we rotated it, and then we developed this method. So, and I did
Yeah.
that in the next two schools on the SLT, whose turn is it to chair, and with the head, I was one of the people on the rota. And it was
Yes.
the best meetings were definitely not the ones I chaired. It was like I was able to sort
Interesting.
of say my piece, and the people loved being given that bit of that moment. Okay, this is my meeting. I have to set the
Got
agenda.
it.
I have to,
Yeah.
and they stepped up. So those two things, I felt like they're the only two techniques I've really used a lot. But that kind of just even those things, just
Got it.
breaking up the normal like weary talk. Great.
Well, another one that you've taught me actually that we use is third point conversations, right?
Yeah,
The
yeah,
relational form of speaking back and forth. If you're actually, you're cognitively, emotionally taxed from teaching, and then you walk in a professional collaboration time,
yeah,
what
yeah,
most people do is power down, finally, recovery. And I talk about that transition. We should be less judgmental with each other about, oh, they turned up and gave us our leftovers, gave each other our leftovers. Yeah, of course, like many of us as educators do when we get home to our own families. And
yeah,
so one of the things is how do you elevate? Well, you can have a third point conversation. And so all of our kind of tools in this is listed out. What's the really focused thing we're trying to do? Okay,
yeah,
let's move through a set where we do individual thinking, paired thinking, like you've suggested, or trio. And then let's move to collective thinking around a third point. And if we're in a larger team, we put it up on a whiteboard or we write it out on butcher's paper, and people have all got a pen and post-its. And they're moving around. One of our ideas is a strategy sort. And we might be thinking, what are the evidence-based techniques? We could print off different walkthroughs. Which of the techniques are most likely to have the biggest impact on the problem we're talking about? And which ones are harder to implement? Which ones are easier to implement? And what we would do is get someone to say, what was your answer, Tom? Okay, I put this one as, I think this is a bit harder to implement than this one. And I think this would have a bit more of an impact on that. Okay. And then we move to the next person. How would you move Tom's post-it notes? Now, if they look at Tom and say, Tom, I disagree with you, I'm not sure about that, that's
yeah,
quite interpersonally risky. But looking at the poster and just say, oh, look, Tom, I'm not quite sure. For me, I would say it's a little bit easier than what you've suggested. Okay. But that's just me. And moving post-it notes depersonalizes that. And we look, okay, could we get agreement here? So I really love that idea of a third point conversation where people are actively involved in creating something. It removes this sense of constantly, you use a tennis analogy, that constant, it's almost like if you're the leader, every ball comes back to you. And it's sort
yeah.
of like, no, we want them to be throwing the ball to each other or hitting it to each other. And so
And
um,
I think
by
that sounds like
by
it'll get away
having that,
from
it's really powerful.
the defensiveness. I mean, one of the things that comes up all the time, let's say, for example, you've allocated job roles in a team, and
Yeah.
someone's responsible for behaviour in year eight, and it's problematic. I mean, the staff are saying it. There's a group of kids, and there's some issues. So you start in a team and saying, well, let's talk about behaviour in year eight, and this
Yeah.
person saying, like, hang on a minute, like I feel like I'm being evaluated now. So they're totally defensive. So rather than them saying, yeah, great. Let's talk about that. Help me solve the problem I have. They're
Yeah.
sort of on the defensive, and that's so unhelpful. But I've seen that happen many times. Like it's not your fault. It's the problem
Yes.
you're nominally assigned the role to deal with, but it's all of our problem. Anyway, look, I think I just looking at the time. I was just thinking like, oh my God, we 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 need to stop because look at the time. This is one of our longest episodes. This is our Emma, you see, to help rein us in. I'm just going off.
It's just like you and I in an airport lounge in Australia, heading off to share the message of walkthrough somewhere else, and
I
just
know it's exactly
chatting about education and change whilst waiting for a delayed flight. It's been a joy to have the conversation.
absolutely. Honestly, it's brilliant. Well, I'm going to do a final just to summarize. I mean, you can show people the pruning book one more time.
All
Okay,
right,
so
thanks.
pruning. We've talked about pruning, the pruning principle. We've talked about teaching sprints, and we've talked about elevated conversations. I mean, Simon Breakspear is a machine. He's an amazing man, incredible energy,
Thank you, Tom.
and everyone in Australia knows who he is. It's just and also lots of people I've met in Canada and elsewhere. So it's fantastic. And you're coming to Scotland next year, so I'm going to meet you there because we're doing some work in Aberdeenshire. So
Fantastic.
it's going to be great. So look, thank you for joining us on Mind the Gap.
Well, Tom, thank you for having me, and thanks for the friendship and the professional, generative conversations over the years. Really, walkthroughs and Rosenshine, the work you've done really enabled so many of our schools here to get moving on evidence-informed practice. And, now one of the things I really enjoy in our professional dialogue is asking, how do we create structures and routines and rhythms for schools that are sustainable around professional learning and growth. And I think for people who are feeling they're overloaded, then probably prune. For people who are looking for shorter cycles of ways of in enhancing practice, maybe sprintify the process you've got. And I really enjoyed this conversation at the end that gets into the interpersonal dynamics because we kicked off talking about systems, but as I said, systems don't change, people change.
Yeah,
And in the end, if policies and reforms don't get right down to adjusting how head teachers and their teams work on improvement, how teachers get together and collaborate, how professionals get a chance to enhance their craft, it's very unlikely any of those policies and reforms are going to have an impact. So have loved having the conversation from the minister's office all the way down to the classroom today, Tom. Thanks
no,
for
it's
the
brilliant.
invitation.
It's absolutely great. So thank you so much, and thank you to everyone listening to Mind the Gap. We've had an incredible season since September, and I just keep looking down the list, thinking it's incredible the different people we have in our world, and Simon is a legend amongst them. Thank you for listening. Enjoy the rest of the season, and there's more to come. See you soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you for listening to Mind the Gap. I'm Emma Turner and I've been presenting with my co-host Tom Sherrington. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, share on social media and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Find us on our YouTube channel, search for Mind the Gap with Tom and Emma, or head over to Spotify for an audio version. This podcast was produced in association with Haringey Education Partnership, and our producer for today's episode was Luke Kemper.